was about to take place that would shake the foundations of the civilized world.
It is time to open your mind. Time to discover your divine self as we navigate this holographic matrix together. Strap in, Cosmic Family, as we slide through this wormhole of cosmic information together in search of the truth.
You can't handle the truth.
It's time to go inside the Matrix.
Inside the Matrix.
With your host, Jimmy Brent.
Okay, welcome to Inside the Matrix today. Hope everybody's doing well. I'd like to welcome all of you. And today our special guest is Benjamin Balderson. Benjamin grew up on a farm and worked with plants and animals his whole life. He began studying the occult and theology at age 12. In his 20s, he started practicing plant alchemy and earned 2 mechanics degrees as well as becoming an industrial electrician. He became a gemologist and owned a crystal store in his 30s before moving off-grid. Then he bought raw mountain land and built his own home. He installed off-grid power and a water system in his house and designed a permaculture farm where he lives sustainably and grows his own medicine. He became part of the Eyes Open network about a year ago and started making Odin's Alchemy. He ran thecauldron.net and Fringe TV before leaving to work on his own. He now hosts a channel in his name on YouTube and Odin's Alchemy on BitChute. Benjamin, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jimmy. Fantastic to be here.
So much to talk about, and just in your, you've got such a varied amount of talents that I just touched on in your introduction there. So I'll let you, if you would, please give our listeners just a brief outline of your story, how you got to be where you're at today, and how you got to be interested in alchemy and all these other wonderful things you're doing.
Absolutely. So like you said, I grew up on a farm, and I've always been an avid reader. And when I was 12, back then you could order, books basically, and they had like BMG Music Club and stuff. And they just mail you these things, and you just signed it and mailed it back, and they'd send you stuff. And I'm like 12, and something came in the mail that looked fascinating, was a book. So I signed my parents' name and sent it out. And, eventually that I paid for that. But that started a love affair on just alternative thinking altogether. So I started doing alternative thinking and studying those kind of things. Well, then in my normal life, I just do my own growing and my own farming. And originally, actually, where I started alchemy was trying to make my own medicine with marijuana, because I have Wilson's disease. So copper will gather on top of my brain, and it will end up short-circuiting my brain until I have grand mal seizures.
Wow.
And that is an extremely strong medicine for stopping that. So while dealing with that, I was going through the stages of making the medicine. And at the same time, I'm reading all these old esoteric books, and some of them, like the ones that are applying to alchemy, I was actually seeing the steps and the things that I was going through. So then I started looking at the other things some of these books were saying and figuring out the things that they were doing. And I started putting all of it together. And as you see it happening right in front of your eyes, you really start having an understanding for what they're trying to say when they're doing these hidden talks. And I don't even know if all of it's necessarily hidden, but if it's like watching two mechanics talk. It makes no sense to somebody that doesn't have any idea about mechanics, even if they're interested in it. Right. Because they've got all kinds of terminology that means something to them and the way things operate. So if you get the operations and the mechanics of it down first, then when you read those things, you're like, oh, that's when this happens. I understand that. So that took me down the entire left-hand path, because before that I'd studied all kinds of different theologies. And then that put me right dead on the left-hand path, because then I was looking at everything myself, and I ended up following like Hermes Trismegistus and looking a lot of the Egyptian things and whatnot. And then eventually I found Odin, and everything that I could read about the way things were aligned perfectly with alchemy. And I ended up following that path, but Odinism is, again, a left-hand path. But
Okay,
that's where you're...
Could you sort of let our listeners know what you mean by left-handed path? I think I kind of know what you mean, because it's talked about in other applications or spiritual practices as well, like the Kabbalah and things like that, right?
Right. So what a lot of people mean when they mean left-hand path is they mean evil. And where they're getting that connotation is from like people like Aleister Crowley and whatnot.
Right.
Because if you're left-hand path, you're free to do to take and reason through things. You're free to do that.
Do what thou wilt is what he
Right.
said, but that he meant it in a whole different way.
Right. That doesn't mean you're free of the consequences of your actions. It just means that, you're a free soul in this world and you can do what you want, but you're definitely not free of consequences. Right. And so the left-hand path for me isn't evil or good in any way. It's more of you're going out to find out how the universe works yourself in a natural way, as compared to you take even Asatru compared to Odinism. They just follow the theology, of the stories, and just follow that, and what's said is what's said. And a lot of times don't really put any thought into the mechanics. It just truly is a story to them. So there isn't any mechanics in them for it in them, and they don't realize that most theologies, when you start breaking them down, are an alchemical breakdown of how the universe works.
Mm-hmm. Tell us about Odin's alchemy and how that is distinct on its own.
Well, as far as Odin's alchemy, so I'm an Odinist, and then I follow Odin, and Odin has given me a tree of life that is different, but it's not different. What he showed me was that it was incomplete. And so it's actually 3 trees put together, because Odin was Odin, Vili, and Ve. And Odin, Vili, and Ve made man, and each part gave man a piece, and that aligned with the three different alchemical sets. So Odin gave you your higher thought, your soul, and that aligns with your oil. Vili gave you your animal power, your earth, that's your salts. And then Ve gave you your name and your earth, that's your ego. So that's your carbon, your water, and your cellular materials.
Now, is this tied into Norse mythology in any way, or is this something completely different?
That is Norse mythology, that Odin, Vili, and Ve made man, and that's the things that they gave to man.
Okay. And do we have any time frame for this? I know our history is so messed up.
Oh, absolutely not. Absolutely not. And then the worst part is a lot of what has come through that most people are reading. So the biggest translator was Snorri Sturluson, who was a Christian at that, and so he heavily Christianized everything. And most of those works are just unavailable to anybody. And then there's a few translations, and the problem with translations is immediately. So one of my very favorite stories, there's a part where Odin is pretending to be somebody else, and Thor wants to cross this river, and so he's disguised, and Thor yells over, and boatman, come carry me across, and Odin just starts trash talking, and he's sitting over there, and Thor's like, do you know who I am? I did all these amazing deeds. And Odin's like, yeah, I was in bed with your mom. And, it just razzing him. And he says all these just outrageous things, provoking the heck out of Thor, who can't cross this river. And Thor's like, I'd get over there and I'd beat you. And Odin's like, yeah, I bet you would, wouldn't you? Well, it's about 2 days walk that way, So when then Thor actually has to go walk, and then it doesn't ever show the rest of it. And I always surmise that Odin gives him all kinds of crap for being late when he actually shows up, not knowing that it was the other guy. Well, historians take the translators take what he said, and they're like, so Odin was this lecherous, and he'd go sleeping with all these people. He was trash talking. And if you were a heathen or lived or worked on a construction site or got out of a classroom for 2 minutes, you would understand these things because these were more realistic people.
Right. Now, do you think that a lot of these characters in ancient mythology like this, were they humans like we were, or were they another species of human, or what's your take on that?
So we've got to break this down alchemically, like everything else, because alchemy teaches you how everything in the universe works.
Okay.
So now we've got to get an understanding of the pantheons of gods. Now, when most people are talking about gods, they're talking about etheric beings. They aren't even talking about the all, which encompasses everything that we all live into. You can't interact with the all individually, just like one of your individual cells doesn't sit down and have a chat with you. So it's just we live inside the all. So they're talking about etheric beings, and that's beings just moving faster than us. And that's typically what we're worshiping. And so that would be like Tyr and all those gods. Then there's also dense beings, which a lot of times are pawned off as demons. In Norse mythology, we call them land wights. And so land wights are your dense earthy beings. So that's going to be like an elemental or a demon. You know, it's even in Christianity, it's a fallen angel. So when you have if we start out at middle line and they're higher beings, they're moving faster, well, it would just be a slower moving being, something that's more dense and material. Okay. So your good ideas and your higher thinking comes from them etheric beings. But then on this manifest plane that we live on, because we live on a manifest plane, well, that you need to also access the material in order to manifest anything. A good idea isn't worth anything. I could come up with the cure for every disease on the planet right now, and if I didn't actually produce it and manifest it, nobody would care.
Right. And it's just like if you wanted to build a house, you could, in your mind, design it perfectly, but if you didn't ever get your hands on materials to actually do it, it would be useless.
Right. And then the third thing is your ego, which is the person experiencing this plane. And that would be like your general contractor that's putting the two things together. Okay. And so alchemically, then your job is to take and remove that ego, because you're a three-part being if you live on this plane. And if you take the beings such as Odin and Mithras, Hermes Trismegistus, each of those had three minds. These are your threefold gods. So they aren't an etheric or a dense being. They were all three. They lived on this plane, and they walked a walk that we can follow. They took and got rid of the ego, where Odin hung on Yggdrasil for 9 days, and Yeshua got hung on the cross. They're going through their alchemical process and disposing of the ego and giving that back to the earth as a sacrifice. That's a point that I would very much like to make right now, because there's so much harsh talk about the ego. And the ego is the thing that initially is allowing you to exist on this plane, because your dense and your etheric, right, and up until this point, are counter to each other. So inside the ego, it allows you to be in this plane. And the test is burning through that ego. And that's something that's precious. When you go to do a sacrifice isn't something you don't care about or that's nasty and rotten. It's something that's precious to you, that means something. That's what your sacrifice is. So your experience in this life on this planet, when you go back into your purity, is the sacrifice that you have. And so that's an important thing. So you give that back to the earth. That was the thing that allowed you to be here and take this test, and you're now passing the test. And
now, when you're talking about sacrifice, this is the sacrifice of the ego, right? This is nothing physical, right?
Right. This is a sacrifice of the ego.
Okay.
Correct. Yes, they don't actually physically die.
Yeah.
Because we're not.
I wanted to clarify that.
I'm an alchemist, not a necromancer.
Yeah, I wanted to clarify that because, especially now, with all this stuff coming out about these Satanists doing sacrifices and weird, crazy stuff like that, I don't want in any shape or form infer that this has anything to do with that kind of madness.
Absolutely not. This is absolutely natural things, and the way you look at all of this and find all this out is one of the seven laws that just bind the universe. This is the way the universe works, and one of them is the law of correspondence, which is as above, so below. And so what you do is you start out with, because these kind of concepts, as I'm just spitting them out, are certainly hard to understand. So as an alchemist, you go to plants, and plants are easy to understand. You can break those down right in front of your very eyes and watch this entire same process happen. And you can parallel that up to the next level or down and start breaking things up and down, because a lock, no matter how much bigger and fancier, still works about the same as a lock that's just a simple old lock.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay, well, continue along those lines, because that's fascinating.
So we've got the threefold gods who had three minds, and then every one of them goes through a torture, like basically a torture test, which in alchemy is your nigredo. And you're going through the fire, and it burns out what you are not. The fire only burns away what you are not, and it leaves a purity of you. So, and that's a hard thing, because you're sacrificing, you're giving up these things, and it's scary to give up those things. Am I going to love all these things that I care about, or is that just some kind of materialistic thing I only care about because at this very time period it's something is important? But in the grand scheme of things, when I become a greater being, is it going to be important? Am I going to lose that? And that's a hard thing.
Yeah.
And so this is a painful process. But after you go through it, then all of a sudden it's always this shining great being that has all this power. Now, unfortunately, in heathen mythology, there's a jump, because there's all kinds of pieces missing. So it goes from Odin, Vili, and Ve, and it talks about them, but it doesn't completely go through where this was an alchemical process. And after that, it's just Odin. So they took out the actual alchemical process where he was going through that, except for the Yggdrasil. They didn't show where the two brothers were also disappeared and sacrificed. He sacrificed himself to himself. It says that, but it doesn't give a much greater explanation, which is, again, why when you start taking the mechanical process in ahead of time and then you draw it up, you understand that he sacrificed his ego to the purity of himself so he could become a pure being.
Okay.
So, and like I said, that's a painful, painful process, but in no way evil. Change is always a painful process. That first day of school was scary. That first day of everything is scary. The new job, it's hard. It's confusing, but that's the way it is. And that's how you become greater, is you just keep doing that.
It seems that you have to widen your perspective on what's important and what your goals are, to not being just your own tiny little world, but to be more of a universal being, as opposed to being, Billy Bob Smith, living in Podunk or whatever. You know what I mean?
Right. Well, you tie into the universal being, but then you also understand. So it's your first responsibility is to you. And making yourself grow, because you can't even really help anybody else. If your field's fallow, you can't feed anybody else. So that's a fact. So your first responsibility is to understanding how the universe works. And then as you understand how the universe works, just like in your body, you don't want cancerous cells that go against the grain and the growth of the universe. You start understanding you also have a responsibility in that. And you don't want to be the cancerous cell that goes against our particular universe and become the bad thing, because that's what that amounts to. When you're the person going against the grain and telling people to do things that are very harmful and hurt little children and do things that inside nobody thinks is right. You are a cancer cell. And when you go around and start getting other people into groups, you are a malignant cancer cell. And when that kind of thing takes over too much of the host dies.
Mm-hmm. And then that leaves the host susceptible to being overtaken by other malevolent beings, right?
Absolutely. These people are just, some of the things that they are into are so weird. But the whole thing is they've hid everything in their religions, and that includes in my own. Like I said, there's all kinds of very odd things where they don't understand the mechanics anymore, which is why I'm desperately trying to show people just simple plant alchemy and start getting that brain moving again and see how the universe actually functions. And then they can read these stories, say, oh, hey, yeah, that's easy. I draw this over. Mm-hmm. And once you start drawing these things over, you don't have any problems at all with understanding them. And then you automatically start aligning with the better parts of that.
Sure. And to me, this is very much in line with what I've always felt. Any kind of higher learning or just progress as a human being requires a couple of things. One, some curiosity, and two, an open mind. So for any of us that have any desire to progress as human beings, to raise our consciousness, to expand our consciousness, these things are required. And it seems also, as you go down this path, that you learn that so many things have been hidden from us. Like the teaching that you're talking about. This is not something that's in any kind of mainstream. You have to take it upon yourself to go out and find something like this and learn it for yourself and take that personal responsibility. And so much of this boils down to personal responsibility, being responsible for your life. Religions make it easy for people not to be responsible for their life and to pawn it off on some entity or some church or some priest or guru or whatever. And it takes away that personal responsibility. But personal growth and expansion of consciousness requires a huge amount of personal responsibility.
And that's where the right-hand path goes wrong, is where these religions, because they're following a group, which I understand, not everybody's going to be the highest level of thinkers, so they aren't going to get everything. But then when you start putting everything in your hands of a few, they start twisting and turning, and before you know it, you're just as twisted as Aleister Crowley ever could have possibly been.
Yeah.
And doing things in mass now. Yeah. With numbers.
Yeah, it is. It's really gotten crazy. But at the same time, so much is being revealed to us that was hidden before. And that's the good part, that a lot of it is becoming public knowledge if people are willing to open their eyes and their ears and listen and see what's happening and be aware of what's out in the world. And that's what I'm hoping for, is to see more and more people do that. So right now we're coming up on the first break. This is fascinating and absolutely enjoyable material. I can't wait to explore this a little more. Maybe on the break, after the break, we'll get into some of the actual mechanics of working with plants. I think
absolutely fantastic.
Okay, so our guest today is Benjamin Balderson. We're talking about alchemy, and you're listening to Inside the Matrix.
You're listening to Inside the Matrix. Inside the Matrix. Now, streaming the truth from somewhere along the extraterrestrial highway.
Welcome to the desert of the real.
Your ambassador to the unknown and host of Inside the Matrix, Jimmy Brent.
Okay, welcome back. We're with our guest, Benjamin Balderson, alchemist. And we're having a really interesting conversation here, and I know that there's a lot of questions out there. So please feel free to throw your questions in the chat or link with us on Skype, and send us your questions, because I'm sure there's plenty of them out there. I know I have a ton of them myself. So Benjamin, before the break, we mentioned a little bit about, let's just talk about plants for just this touch on it. We have so many things we want to touch on, but let's just talk, because I think people can sort of relate to the idea of breaking down plants And let's just discuss that a little bit.
So we'll try and rip through this kind of simply. So when you, as an alchemist, what you start out is you go out and pick a fresh plant in the very morning before it hits the sun hits it, because in the morning before the sun hits it is when it has the most oil in it, and the oil is your feminine, and so you want to pick it when it has its highest feminine. Then you take and cover that up, take it in, and you start your alchemy process. Now, at first, you look at this plant, and let's take a lavender plant. And this is a beautiful plant. This is amazing. But what you're seeing, as you're going to understand shortly, is the ego. That is the thing you're appreciating at this point in time, is the beauty of the cellular material in the carbon in the water and how that is arranged. Because the fact is that same combination includes 90% of every organic living thing is 90% of those same materials. So it's just the arrangement of that you're appreciating. So the first thing you do is you break that thing down and pulp it all up into nothing. And now you've just got a pile of mush that's not even particularly pretty anymore. And you start the fermentation process. And what the fermentation process is going to do is that's going to start pulling. It's going to do a couple things here. It's going to open up the third level of oil, the highest level of oil, because you're going to find out before the end of this that you have 3 levels of oil that each break down into 4. Now, the third level is not typically active. Now, a lot of people are going to be aware of how THC works, because a lot of people mess with their own home medicine in this way and don't do it in any other way, but all plants work about the same. And until you oxycarbonate the THC, you can't eat it and make it into anything. You've got to actually get that and activate that highest level of oil, which in cannabis is THC.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then the other thing that it's going to do is the fermentation process is a biome of bacteria that are eating away at the plant, and they're going to produce a byproduct of ethyl alcohol, and the ethyl alcohol is going to pull the oil away from the body. So just like if you take alcohol and take some Everclear and dump it on your arm and dry it off, and that spot of your arm is all super dry, it pulls the oils away from the plant also.
Oh, okay.
So now, and that's where you're getting your purity from, is like you take like a apricot brandy. It was fermented in apricot, and then they pull out the oil, and it's just a wine, and then they ferment it and pull out the alcohol to refine out more of the oil, and it starts getting higher and higher, and then you're getting more actual alcohol and less oil, and where like Everclear, you got like 98% purity of alcohol, and the other 2% is going to be corn oil.
Okay.
So now that's pulling away the oil, you separate the body and the spirit. So the one side is going to be just a pile of just nasty, eaten apart plant matter, and the other side is going to be a wine. Okay?
And that's now, the oil, right?
Right. The oil is going to be inside of the wine.
Okay.
So just like when you're using Jack Daniels or whatever to cook with, when you cook, the alcohol vaporizes off, and what's left is that oil that is what's giving the flavoring.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the same concept. The oil is still residing inside the alcohol here in the wine. So you separate out the wine and then the plant material. Now with the wine, because we're alchemists, we're going to put this in the still, and we're not stilling out the alcohol to get the alcohol, although you can use that as a solvent to pull out the oil out of other plants, so that way you don't do the fermentation process, so you can get a little bit heavier oil pull. But that also does include the natural activation of the highest oil and things like that. So, but you can save it to try and mix that together, and then also for cleaning and whatnot. And after you've distilled off the alcohol, which alcohol comes off at a very low heat. So you dump this in your alembic, and the alembic's a closed system, and it heats up, and the alcohol vaporizes off and flows through the tube and gets caught in another little catch. In mine, it's a bulb.
Okay.
So then you crank the heat up a little bit more, and first it's going to be a methyl alcohol, then it's going to be an ethyl alcohol, and then so once all the alcohol is gone, then the next thing that's going to come out in all different plants is going to be a terpene. Now, terpenes is the taste and the smell in all your plants.
Now, how do you know in that process, when you're transitioning from taking the alcohol out to the next step of the terpenes?
So within a degree or two, all the alcohol, and it's a very patient process, because you just sit there and you wait and you wait and you watch your alembic, and you'll see the vapor coming up as it's creating vapor. And when it stops, alcohol is a big jump between alcohol and oil for what it takes to vaporize off. Oh, okay. So just like you can leave you can mix some oil and some alcohol and leave it out on the counter, and in a day or two, that alcohol is just going to evaporate, and you'll just have the little stuff in the bottom. So alcohol evaporates really quickly. Actually, funny story about that. When I was in the Army, the guys that drank beer over in Saudi Arabia, you weren't allowed to have beer. So they would take and pour gasoline over top of their beers, and that would evaporate off so quickly it would pull the heat out of there. So it's just a quick evaporation of things, because it's how volatile it is, and gas is super volatile. Well, alcohol is also super volatile. If you've ever taken a flame to Everclear, highly volatile. So that as it evaporates off really fast, it pulls away heat from the other substances. Okay. So that's a pretty interesting process. So it's a pretty big jump. So you just got to be patiently wait until the evaporation process stops. And then you rotate it up a couple degrees and make sure there's nothing else, because sometimes there's a little bit heavier and a little bit more stable that will evaporate off. But then you're going to have to rotate, depending on the terpene set, 30, 40 degrees. You can start evaporating the alcohol off easily at 90. You're going to have to get up to about 150 before you start getting any real action out of your oils.
Oh, okay. I see.
So it's a pretty stiff jump.
Yeah.
So then when you start getting to the low, so you try and do it a few degrees at a time until you start seeing some vaporization. And then once you start getting some good vaporization, you stop. And that means that you're at that level, and that's the volatility level that you're at. And so your terpenes are always first, and that's your smell and your smell and your flavor. That's why when you cook food, that's what's making your mouth water. That's what's making your stomach growl and the bile start producing, because the oil is a key. The oil opens things up inside of you. Just like in THC, the high that you're experiencing is putting you in a state so you can receive the salts. Okay, so and this is how all oils work. So with the terpenes, it's real easy, because that just automatically is so easy to explain, because people understand how food works. Right. But that smell did not fill your stomach. It actually made you hungrier, because now you need that salt, that material, to come in and fill that void, because that's what the feminine is the void. The masculine is the push. Okay. So now you're getting to that terpene level. You get all the terpenes off, and then you rotate it up again, and then you get your next level of oils. Now with cannabis, that's one everybody knows is CBD. And you do this same process again, and then you do it again, and you'll end up with THC.
Okay.
So now you take each of those bulbs and you put them back in the alembic by itself, and you clear out the alembic. And you take all them levels back out of the alembic by themselves, and you do this same process with each of them.
Okay, let's back up a little bit. I just explain what an alembic is. I'm picturing a chemistry lab and some kind of glass hardware. Is that what that is?
It's basically a glass bulb that's creating a sealed environment that has a tube coming off the top that will catch. So anything that gets vaporized has no choice but to go through that. So I can catch it in another, and then it goes through, is able to cool down and turn back into a liquid after it goes to gas, and then go back into a liquid and falls into another bulb.
So you've collected how many different things at this time?
So at this point in time, by the time you split those 3 oils each into 4 components, you have 12 component oils.
Wow. Okay.
So, and a lot of people will be aware of THCA, THCB, THCC. So what is happening is when you get to the THC level, then that first bit of THC that comes off, that first quarter is going to be THCA, and then the next stable quarter is going to be THCB. The next most stable quarter is going to be C. See how that works?
Yeah. And what's the difference?
Well, the difference is just the fractions. So we're just talking about the stability of the fraction. So the first fraction is considered the fire fraction, which is unstable. And then you go all the way up and you get to your more earthy fractions where you're more stable. And it's just the stability of the fraction. And depending on if you're working with medicines and whatnot, the different fractions, say you want a drastic change, you're going to look at the fire fraction, if you're getting that on point with it, where if you want something more stable, obviously you're going to go to the more stable fractions.
Okay. So
now you've got your oils all split up. Now you put them, now that you've done this, let's switch over to the body side. Okay. And a lot of people are going to be familiar with a little bit familiar with some of the terminology on the Nigredo. So the first thing you're going to do is this ugly pile of fermented plant matter. You're going to throw it in a cauldron or whatever you want to call it. And you're going to throw it to the fire. And it's going to start on fire. It's going to burn up and it's going to smoke. So the first thing that's going to happen is the blackening. Now, the blackening is the activating of the carbon. Now, a very useful tip of this is you can easily see this when you do campfires. So if you want to make your own activated carbon, you just go out and you make a campfire with some nice hardwood, like some manzanita or some oak or something, and you make a campfire. And when you have a pile of glowing hot embers, you take and you throw them in a bucket. You pick that out, you rinse it off, you grind it up, and you'll notice that's the activated carbon that they're selling for just an insane amount at the stores. So what you're doing is you're bringing out the carbon, and this is the first step in Nigredo, where the very earthy things, the things from this plane of your existence, you're activating it, bringing it out, and this is the start of the test.
Okay, now is this something, I'm sort of picturing something like a frying pan or something that you're putting over a fire with this. So, and then you're sort of frying it up or cooking it that way, and then it becomes an ash, right?
It goes, well, first it becomes a very black pile.
Okay.
And then eventually it will become a gray ash. And then you've got to keep going. And this process will just get crazy because every now and then you want to stop and grind it up and break it down finer and finer to try and help the process along and break it down. And you're sitting there for 6-8 hours on just a little pile of plant material. And it's like, holy cow. And just like Gandalf the Grey, you have to go into the fire again. And then eventually you come out a chalk white. So you'll end up with a white chalky substance. And that means that all the carbon has been released. And you now have just the cellular material, which is the ash, and then some metal particulates, because you have metals in you, which the Gnostics and a lot of your metaphysical books would call the archons and things like that. That's your metal particulates. And then you have your salts.
Now,
Well,
the plants would draw these metals out of the earth, right?
absolutely. And incorporate them into their system. And so when they're talking about like the way Mars, the god of Mars affects you, the argument should be whether there's an intelligence behind it, because you got Mars, which is iron. And if Mars is in a retrograde and it's pulling negatively at the iron in your blood, you're going to have the negative effects of that. And it's going to cause you to react in a certain way. And if it's on the positive, it's going to have you to react in another way. So whether you want to believe that that's conscious or not, that's an entirely another story. But that's how it works, and that's why when the archons talk about the way the Gnostics talk about the way the archons affect you, like when they took mandrake root, you'll see that shuts down all the metals, and you can't. Now you are operating without that. So, and it poisons you while it's doing it, but it gives you supposedly a more, the way they understand it is then you're more operating in your purity. And so it gives you a glimpse of that. So the salts, though, they are water soluble. So you take distilled water and you pour it into that white chalky powder, and then you take and just make that into a nice mix, and then you strain that out until it's clear water. And that's what's left in them strainers. That's going to be your ash, your cellular material that's been broken down to its finest components. Okay. And then you're going to take that clear water and you're going to let that evaporate, and you're going to find that in the bottom there's a nice pile of clear salt crystals, and these are going to be your 12 cell salts. So the 12 cell salts match up to the 12 oils. So now it's time to put those back together. So you put those back together with the stuff that was originally in the alembic.
The oil, all the oils that we pulled out.
Well, the stuff that we originally didn't pull out, everything goes back together basically, because you want that fermented agent back in there, because that activates some things, and you let that ferment again for a little bit. And then you take and just throw that alembic back to the heat. And now you're going to find is that this interlocks the salts and the oils. Before this, if I took fire to the masculine side, which is what we did to make the masculine side form up, that's what made it become hard and become itself. That's where it went through the orange stage. When it becomes white, you'll notice as the fire's on it, it'll go into a red and then a yellow. And that's them crystals forming up and glowing. And that's all the fire will make that do now. If I take the fire to the oil side, the oil will evaporate, rise up, cool down, and fall back to the earth. So, and that's what a normal plant life cycle is. If a plant dies out on the planet, it falls down, the water evaporates out, the oil evaporates out, the body starts to rot and deteriorate, it rots and the carbon gets released, and the plant rots away, and then eventually the salts get released. So the salts fall down and then come back up, the oil rises up and comes back down, and eventually the oils and the salts will meet again, and you have a new life. And that's the infinity of life. Unless, as an alchemist, you take and you do this makes it so now if I take the salts and the oil and put them to the heat, the salts and the oil will rise up and fall. The salts will not leave the mix. They're interlocked as one. So what you can imagine, so this is the phoenix. Now this is something that doesn't change. Now you can mix it with anything. It will rise and fall. And when you throw that to the heat again, put it to the fire, it's going to rise up and fall down, and it's going to be a purity of oil and a purity of salt.
Oh, so what are you going to do with that?
Well, with that, now we're talking about this gives the medicine that much more punch. So this is why Rick Simpson oil, we're going to fall back again to cannabis, because that's usually the one most people are the most aware of. Yep. So when you take dabs or you smoke a joint or you do any of those things, they only have very modest medicinal effects. When you do dabs, it has almost no medicinal effects, but it gets you very high, which is, like I said, setting you in a certain state. Now,
what's a dab? I'm sorry, I don't know.
That's just purified marijuana oil, THC oil, and CBD oil.
Okay.
So when you take Rick Simpson oil or RSO, now that is all over the place for having all kinds of crazy medicinal effects, and is acclaimed to cure cancer, Crohn's disease. Depending on the article you're looking at, the list is fairly astonishing.
Yep.
Well, Rick Simpson is using the body and the oil. He's not chucking just the oil, and it's a very nasty black paste.
Yeah.
So,
I've seen it.
So this isn't purified in any ways, but he's still leaving the salts and the body. Well, basically the thing, that nasty black, as we just learned a little bit ago, is just carbon. Carbon isn't the medicine. Carbon is good for you, but we're talking about in this medicine. So to make it a purity of itself, you pull out all those other things. And so Rick Simpson's oil is so much on the path, and I actually do a version of that. I'm going to have the video out for that just shortly. And I used to have one out, but I do a version of that because that's how you start with your plant medicine. But eventually you move up to distilling and things like that, and you start getting greater purity, and with greater purity you get more efficacy.
Right. And of course, all of this has been hidden from us because they don't want healthy people running around. They want people that will spend money on pharmaceuticals and make all these people rich and keep everybody mildly ill so that they have to keep coming back for more poison.
Absolutely. Just keep them right on the merry-go-round, and rather than going right out in their backyard and finding things that are way more naturally bioavailable for you. Because this is a thing that a lot of people don't understand is the bioavailability. This is how the salts and the oils work together, is to create bioavailability.
Sure.
I hear music.
Yeah, we're coming up on the break again. This is so fascinating. I can't wait to keep going on this and talk a little bit more about the efficacy and how the body interacts with these purified ingredients from the plants. And so you're listening to Inside the Matrix, and today's guest, Benjamin Balderson. We're going to take a short pause right here. Stick around with us. We'll be right back.
Radio Network.
It is worldwide.
Broadcasting from an undisclosed location deep within the neon capital of the world, Las Vegas, Nevada. For more information on the host and the show, please visit InsideTheMatrix.org. That's InsideTheMatrix.org. It's time to break the chains of manipulated consciousness and claim our true nature as creative, divine beings. Inside the Matrix. Inside the Matrix.
This is KCOR Las Vegas, home of the Digital Radio Network, broadcasting from a shack just south of Area 51.
Wait, that doesn't exist.
This is the KCOR Digital Radio Network. Now for the news.
An incident was about to take place that would shake the foundations of the civilized world.
It is time to open your mind. Time to discover your divine self as we navigate this holographic matrix together. Strap in, Cosmic Family, as we slide through this wormhole of cosmic information together in search of the truth.
You can't handle the truth.
It's time to go inside the Matrix.
Inside the Matrix.
With your host, Jimmy Brent.
Okay, we're back with our guest, Benjamin Balderson. I hope you all are enjoying this as much as I am, this fascinating subject here. Before the break, we were breaking down and combining oils and ash together, the male and the female components of plants, to hopefully create medicinal type things. So, Benjamin, you want to take it back from there?
We washed the ash out, so it's the oil and the salt now.
Okay, oil and salt.
You betcha. So now that we've got the purity of oil and the purity of salt, and those have fermented and repopulated, We distill that off again. And so just like with the Rick Simpson oil, we've got both components in there now, except for after the distillation process now, it's a purity of the oils and salts. It's not, everything else has been knocked out. And so the oil opens up all these pathways. And like the funny thing is, like, when they talk about how that high and it makes you happy and like that's a horrible thing, it's fairly basic medicine that people in a good mood and that are happy heal faster. So it certainly seems to me that one of the most medicinal plants on the planet, for it to have a component that just naturally does that for you, seems fairly ingenious. Yeah. I'm not sure why you're criticizing that like it's a bad thing, because it seems fairly genius to me.
Yeah,
but
I agree.
So it opens up all these pathways, and now in a purity, it does that really well. And now your salts come in behind it and give you the punch. So just like with electricity, the voltage is the pathway or the riverbed, and then the amperage is what's doing the actual push or work. But it doesn't, but you could have 1,000,000 amps without the volts and they won't go through. And if you have, a closed riverbed, your amps won't go through. And if you have no amps as wide as the riverbed does, it won't push much. So you've got to get both together, and that's where it's a two-part system. And one's making the things bioavailable for your body, just like the terpenes made you start producing bile and made your body get ready to eat some food. It's a two-part system. And then you put in the food, or else you're going to find that a fairly unsatisfying first part.
Yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense. And synthetic drugs are one-sided synthetic versions, right?
Absolutely one-sided. They actually typically are going on the feminine side of things. And even the more natural paths do this, where you see them all using essential oils. And essential oils are fantastic. Do not get me wrong and take it as I'm knocking them in any way. But understand that the feminine is the key, and without the masculine push, you're not getting at all the benefits you should. You're getting one-sided. Now, there are instances where you do just want feminine activity, like you have a virus, and you're just trying to get something to pull that out, that's where elderberries are very feminine, and it's an incomplete, so it grabs onto viruses and tries to, complete itself. And then eventually will grab onto you if you take it in too high doses and, again, poison you. It's funny how almost everything's like that. But but up in small doses, it will attack viruses and feminine grab onto them. And sometimes, like, say you have an overabundance of something in your body, you want to strip something out. Obviously, then the feminine side is always going to seek balance with that masculine side, so it'll pull. So just like if you drink distilled water, which is water completely devoid of salt, then it will actually pull salts from your body. And that's why if you drink a bunch of distilled water, you'll actually not even hydrate more. You need that salt in there.
Okay, so there's a lot of people discussing all the time, oh, you should drink distilled water all the time, or you shouldn't drink it, or what's your feeling on that?
There's nothing wrong with distilling the water, but if you're going to distill the water, you need to go purchase cell salts and put salts in either at least take them, take a substantial portion of those, and then salt your food more. Or else you don't drink distilled water. Either put it right in your food or start taking some cell salt tablets. Because
Gotcha.
if you're just regularly drinking distilled water, you are doing very bad things for yourself. You are stripping out your cellular salts.
Okay. Now, the other thing you mentioned about the essential oils, how would you give more punch to those essential oils and make them more effective?
So you would take the plant material immediately, even without putting it through the end of the process, and it's a foreign oil, you could immediately just take, I got some lavender oil. Go down to your Whole Foods, get some fresh lavender, or not Whole Foods. I am so sorry. I can't believe I said that one. The farmer's market, something like that. Get yourself some fresh lavender. I think I just passed the Whole Foods down the road here, and so it just popped into my head, like the farmer's market or something. And get yourself some nice fresh lavender, and then go home, and you can easily do the nigredo process of it. Even if you don't put it through the fermentation, even if you don't have alcohol, you can pulp that up, grind the body up, release the salts, turn it into a white powder, and pour some distilled water in there. There you're using distilled water because you don't want any of the mineral salts from something else in your procedure.
Right. You only want those salts from what you've
from what you're doing, right?
Processing, yeah.
So, and this is where distilled water becomes very handy. So you take and just get and release out some salts, and then put them in with your oil concoction, and you're going to put some punch right back into it because now you've got all the component pieces.
Okay, makes a lot of sense.
You bet.
All right, so let's talk a little bit more about plants as medicine and how you determine maybe what plants are for what. I mean, there's a lot of there's some ancient books on this kind of thing, but have you studied that end of it?
Well, so there are some little tricks, to it. So when you're looking at things that are more, if you're looking for like your stomach biome, look at garlic. That garlic lives in the plant biome. So that's going to be your more biome heavy things. Your more fruity things are going to be like your more upper things. Then colors also, you start learning about colors where your darker ones are usually for like more heady things. Your lighter ones, it's very color coordinated. It's very interesting. But
coordinated with the chakra colors?
Yeah. It really kind of does, and the different ailments that you have in those areas. And this isn't always the case by any means, but you start noticing the patterns of it. And then when the variations happen, there's usually a reason behind it. But for all practical purposes, if you go down to your local used bookstore, there is all kinds of plant remedy books that you can buy that are pretty easy to find. And then you get the old school ones that have the weird names also. So that way you can find things like one of the most highly medicinal things that nobody talks about is mistletoe. In mythology, they refer to it as the golden bough. And if you look it up, the things that it's purported to heal, which this is not, again, my claims. I don't ever make any medicinal claims.
Right.
But if you go ahead and look it up, the things that mistletoe is purported to heal is shocking.
Wow.
And this is even if you go on just WebMD and just the more mainstream, they don't even mess around, but you have to actually ask about it, and who thought about doing mistletoe, or like horsetail, highly medicinal. One thing I can say easily is that's got more silica in it than any other plant in the world. Mm-hmm. So this is one of your high cell salt materials. It's purported to remove heavy metals from your body. So that one's been a real big request lately because so much aluminum and metal toxicity going on. And they're finding out that there's just an entire host of mental diseases from, dementia to autism to all kinds of things. And every single one of those things is an aluminum problem. And
let's talk about that, because right now, I think most people that are probably listening to this show are pretty much aware that we're being sprayed on a regular basis with nano aluminum, barium, strontium, various other materials and particulates in the sky. So most everybody has unwittingly or wittingly and not by their choice absorbed these nanoparticles into their body. And you just can't help it if you're on the plane, if you're in the world.
Right. If you're breathing this air.
You're breathing this air like we all are. You're going to get your dose of it. So it's important for us to try and figure out ways to draw that out. So you're saying horsetail is one of them. I've heard chlorella, spirulina. Are those good as well?
I'm not sure about that one. Colloidal silver does, which colloidal as compared to monoatomic, because in the colloidal state, it still grabs onto things and maintains its feminine aspect, where once you're down to monoatomic, then it does not do that because it's a stable element. Where colloidal's 30 parts per million, obviously monoatomic's 1.
Wow.
So there's a fair host of them that kind of help. And then everybody's system's a little bit different, so you're going to have to go through, and when things start looking redundant, understand that not all of them are going to work as well for everybody, because everybody's system's a little bit different, and the way they eat is different, and all these other things. And I don't know how you take care of yourself. For all I know, you come over to me and ask for all these holistic things, then run down to Taco Bell and grab 3 Cholitos, a Twinkie, and have a pack of cigarettes. I don't know. Like, this didn't make me feel better at all. Well,
yeah. Well, wonder why, right?
Right.
We've got Troy has a question from Skype here. He said that we had made reference to some instructional type videos, or some videos that you had made before. Do you have any videos that walk through this whole process of getting these plants down to a medicinal level, or are you planning on creating a video series like that?
So I just restarted making them. I've got a small number of them out, not a whole lot. As soon as I get home from this Renaissance Festival, I got 2 more that are ready to go out. So I had them all made, but I worked with the station, and then so that's all station property and whatnot. So now that I switched over to YouTube, where everything's going to be free, I'm having to rebuild them. But those videos are under Benjamin Balderson, Balderson, and then Benjamin. So it's Benjamin Balderson. Benjamin was the first name. I forgot. Some people put EN or AN, and mine's IN on YouTube, and then Odin's Alchemy on BitChute.
Okay.
And
yeah, so
I will
definitely
have
subscribe to Benjamin there, and when those videos come out, Troy, you'll be able to view those.
Absolutely, and they're coming out in like basically real time. The fermentation process is happening, and after we go through the whole process, and I'm also doing a shade tree alchemy series at the same time, so those videos are also in there. So a few different levels of alchemy, because obviously not everybody can afford a fractional distillation system. They're not easy to come by. Right. So I've got some other series, so that way you can at least start working with plant medicine and start understanding it. And then after we get through these series, then we'll go into tying the philosophy right to it, so we can see this philosophical things and look at, this is what it means, this is the action that's happening, this is why when you read this in this book and it says it this way, look, it makes sense now while I'm watching it.
Right. Yeah, and everything is relevant on so many different levels, right? We're talking about a very physical level of processing these plants, but it also has a spiritual meaning to all these things as well.
Absolutely, because you just, as above, so below, you draw this up and say, oh, well, this is how I work as a human also. Mm-hmm. So this brings us back to the aluminum and what's going on with all that. So for this, we're going to have to talk about a little bit of mythology.
Okay.
And we look at Roman mythology, and we have to also bear into mind that alchemically, each of the planets is tied to a specific metal.
Right.
So in Roman mythology, we had Gaia, and Gaia somehow just immaculate birthed Uranus, and Uranus became the sky god. Then Uranus and Gaia mated and had the Titans. Now, the Titans are your salt power, and Uranus is your etheric power, the sky god. Well, the sky god then became afraid that the salt power would overtake him, or the Titans would overtake his power, so he flooded the earth with his alumina, with his essence, which is aluminum, And that trapped and locked up all of the Titans except for Kronos.
Wow.
So now let's look at this and use this in our own selves. Well, if we take aluminum, or that same essence that's getting sprayed all over the earth, that shuts down our cell salts. So when you're talking about cell salts, you're talking about your earthy things. And you're also talking about your actual memory. So Masaru Emoto, or however you want to, Masaru, when you looked at his original tests, he went around and took droplets from different areas and flash froze them and the vibrations that they caused. And this was amazing. Right. Yep. So then when he started putting in his own input into it, he realized he had to distill out the salts out of the water in order for that input, because that memory was in the salts. That vibration was coming out of the salts. If you just leave distilled water and do this same test, it always makes a pentagon. You know, the Pentagon ready to take in all information, right? Don't draw any parallels there, folks. So the salts was what was giving it that information. Okay, but the water is what unlocked that so you could see the vibration. Now, so the memory was actually in the salt. Now, you take and draw that same parallel to you, just like they say your root, your ancestry, your heritage comes from your root, your salts. That's where your memories reside also, and they're shutting that down. Now, then you look at Alzheimer's and all these dementia patients and all these other things. And then you also look at like the autistic people. They don't care about anything emotional. They don't care about their ancestry, their human ties. They don't care about how they're living. If you give them the right conditions and let them do what they mentally want to do etherically, they don't even care a bit about their root natural things that you need to do to survive. You know, at certain levels, you know, obviously some of them are more functional. You know, I'm not stating all of them. I'm taking this, you know, obviously to a more extreme.
Sure.
But, you know, the more socially functional, but they still, the things that they start losing is the more root emotional things. And emotion's a dense, rooty thing. You can tell this, like when you listen to your favorite song, a love song, and it's all emotional for you. When you speed that up, you still hear every single word. You still hear every note, but you lose all emotional tie to it. It's just a bunch of words and notes.
Right.
So that's a wall of emotion. You know, it's not a wall of thought. It's a wall of emotion.
And feeling, yeah.
Right. So these are all very dense, rooty salt things. And you look at the aluminum story, aluminum shuts all that down, shuts down the memory area, and they're flooding us with it. Well, barium's driven by a bunch of stars. So then take a look at what barium does when it interacts with aluminum. It keeps it from oxidizing. So if you wanted particulated aluminum to survive through the air to where you could breathe it, and you didn't want it to oxidize and become inert, what would you need to mix it with? Right. They aren't stupid. You know, you just got to start looking at all the different things and drawing all the parallels. And when you start understanding how things work, it's not really that hard to draw it out.
Right. And, you know, the sad thing to me is that as human beings, we need to realize that we are literally under attack. I mean, from every possible angle. I mean, we've got the fluoride and chlorine in our water. We've got the nano aluminum, barium, strontium, and a whole host of other, nanotechnologies and things in the air. We've got GMOs and other chemical components, glyphosate in our food supply. We are literally being attacked, and this is all very subtle because if you look at any one of those, people would not be that alarmed. But if you look at it as the big picture of what's being done to us as a species, or actually being done to the entire world all at the same time, it's really horrible. And we need to wake up to what's going on so we can put a stop to it. And that, again, we always come back down to personal responsibility, because if you don't take responsibility for yourself to become aware to the point where you see these things, then, we really don't have any chance of stopping it. And that's I think a large part of our motivation is that we want people to see this, because we want the best for everyone. And we don't want these people that are motivated by power and greed and the dark side to overtake us completely.
Absolutely. And then they push the light and love and heaven narrative, where at some point in time we're going to ascend and everything's going to be peachy. And so this takes like half the players off the bench, because now that's all. Once you sell them that, they don't want nothing else. They're like, nah, I got sold on this heaven thing. This sounds great. Oh, yeah. And it's against the natural order, because in nature, when does anything stop moving and working and changing? Yeah. Chaos is the only constant.
Right, and that's the only thing that brings about change is that chaos too. And once somebody settles into, hey, I just got to kick back and it's all going to work out. I can,
that's when you die.
Yeah, it's all going to work out. My guru, my teacher, my preacher, my whatever priest or rabbi told me that's the way it's going to go. So I don't care anymore. I'm just going to live my life and yada yada yada.
You betcha.
I wish it was that easy for all of us, and I wish it would work out that way, but I don't see it that way. I see that if we don't stand up for ourselves, it's not going to be a pretty picture. So that's my motivation, and I think it's probably yours too, and a lot of other people out there, is we want to create this awareness. We want people to know what's actually going on, not to scare people, but to empower people to take back their power and quit giving it away to others. Whether it's your doctor, your whoever it is that's in your life that you're given power to, we need to all take back our own power and exercise that in the most productive way. So anyway, I think we're coming up on the break once again. My guest is Benjamin Balderson, alchemist and all-around amazing guy. We're really enjoying his wisdom that he's sharing with us today, and we've got one more segment coming up in just a few. Stick around with us on Inside the Matrix.
You're listening to Inside the Matrix. Inside the Matrix with Jimmy Brent. Now, streaming the truth from somewhere along the extraterrestrial highway.
Welcome to the desert of the real.
Your ambassador to the unknown and host of Inside the Matrix, Jimmy Brent.
Okay, welcome back. Benjamin Balderson, alchemist, is our guest. And boy, we've been hitting on some really incredibly fascinating topics here. We've been discussing the alchemy of plants and how they have incredible medicinal purposes. And alchemy in itself is an amazing topic. It's not just about plants. There's many levels of alchemy. And Benjamin, you touched on that when you talked about the different, I call them the wandering stars out there.
Right, right.
People refer to them as the planets, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Which I don't really have what to say about them, because they're not in our sphere. We don't really have access to them. I mean, we know what we know about them, which is the metals tied to them. And the reason the metals tie to them is because as the light passes through our atmosphere, or the firmament, as it passes through, that light slows down into a solid. And that's where those metals come from. So you look at the different stars, and then you can take that metal and speed it back up with fire and see that same color as the star. Wow. That's how fireworks work. That's how you're getting that colors. They're burning off metals, and you can look at them same stars. So our entire Earth model is kind of I don't understand where a lot of them are coming from. And there's just a lot of kind of confusion. So as an alchemist, we live in an alembic. And if you ever saw the alembic, when you pour what you're going to pour into there, you'll see that there'll be a line, and everything underneath that line, which is a half dome, is your dense fluids. Then on top of that line is where your life is. That's where all the biome happens. Then above that is your etheric portion, or what would be underneath the firmament. Now, I find it very interesting that the sun heats us the way it does. And, outside of that alembic, I'm the heat source. I create the heat source, right? But so then you look at the alembic, and as it's sitting there and this entire thing is working, let's say I cap the system rather than have it hooked to a tube so that way it goes out to be recaptured. I just close that system.
Okay.
I'm going to take, and that's going to, from that center portion, it's going to vaporize off. Things are going to vaporize off, rise up. And when they rise up, they're going to leave away from that heat source. They're going to cool down. They're going to drop back down, and usually as an entire group. So you can even see that as a civilization, because as things start to become more pure and that vapor starts building, it will all of a sudden rise up in that alembic. And even when you don't have it closed, this is how it works. And it'll rise up as like a whole group. And obviously there's some pieces that are way ahead of others. And when you're distilling, like maybe one or two little bits will make it very over the tip, but the whole rest of that vapor cloud will drop violently back down into that whole mix and smash back into the mix and mix it up again and start over, and then that vapor cloud will start rising up again. And this is a civilization. As a civilization, we advance and we become more and more, and then we rise up. And then a few people make it, and then the rest drop back down and restart.
Wow. Talk about as above, so below, right?
Absolutely.
On every single level that there is, whether you're talking about a civilization, an epoch of time, or you're talking about
the season of your garden.
Or season of your garden, or a year. Yeah, or a year. Or you're talking about the process that you go through to, bring these plants down into their elements. It's all the same thing.
Exactly.
And we talked about, not in this show, but I've talked to other people before about the different civilizations that have come and gone in our world. And this is part of a larger, in my mind, is part of a larger version of this process that we're talking about.
Yep, that's the as above, so below, the principal correspondence. You take things, you break them down at a level that you can mentally understand, and then after you understand the mechanics of it, you start drawing them parallels up and breaking down those upper levels or lower levels, depending on what you're trying to figure out. But the idea is you take and break things down to a mechanical level that you understand and then start working out. And this is part of why I understand so many things like mechanics and electricity and gardening. And the more things you know, the more things you can do. And the more things you can do, the more things you can do, which sounds redundant, but it literally starts becoming exponential.
Yeah,
because all this
geometric. Yep.
Yeah, it works on a Fibonacci just like everything else. I learned 3 or 4 different things in the same field, and now even if I don't know, like language, after learning 20 languages, I can learn a language in like 2 days. I don't speak it 20 languages, but an example, those people that can speak it, they learn a language in like 2 days because it just becomes that easy. That exponential jump starts happening.
Oh, absolutely. And I can relate that to guitar playing because as somebody who's played a rather long time, what you do is every time you learn a new technique or a new way of doing things, it works on and combines with other things that you know, and eventually things become a whole lot easier and more readily understood, and your progress becomes much quicker. You become more enabled to do harder techniques, and it works that way with any discipline, I would imagine.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it builds on itself. So like I said, the more things that you can do, the more things that you can do.
Absolutely true. Now, speaking of more things you can do, I wanted to relate this to, we are faced with a group of individuals, entities. I don't even know what they are. I don't know what they are, because they're obviously not human, with their desire to control the world, and not just to control it, but have full spectrum dominance of anything and everything in it, which to me is as close to a definition of insanity as you can get, I would imagine. But
so
we're faced with these entities. They are using alchemy, but in a whole different way.
Absolutely. So you look at the Arceus of Water story, and this one's very interesting because it's also one of those things that they use. Not that I'm saying that there's not Morgellons or whatever. I'm not saying there's not, but the Arceus of Water has existed for hundreds and hundreds of years. And that's where you ferment water, and then you start processing out and distilling the water. And at the end of it, at the end of this distillation process, just like when we were doing it before, we break off those pieces. There's that piece left in the bottom of the flask. Well, that was all a life that you basically created. And that life is what started the breakdown of the plant. So that biosome right there is the thing that was eating away at the prima materia. The prima materia is whatever initial thing you're trying to break down. So in lavender, the yeast is going in and breaking that plant down and ripping it apart. So that piece, when you distill out the pure oils that's left, that thing is called the snake handler. And in all reality, the snake handler is the thing that broke down the prima materia and then allowed it to become a purity of itself. So these nefarious people feel like if they're the ones who break down society, they get to pull out a purity of what they want. They get to be the snake handlers.
Ah, yes. That's exactly what they're trying to do. And they are completely breaking down everything. They're getting people to fight amongst themselves. They're creating division in every possible way, and creating this soup of dissatisfaction and uneasiness among people, and rather than bringing people together, which is what we all want to do. And so this is the interesting battle. This is, in my opinion, this is a spiritual test. This is spiritual testing grounds for all of us.
It is. It's where we're supposed to be trying to. This is where I was coming to at the beginning. We didn't quite get there. I forgot about this.
Yeah, let's go there.
Where we're going with the threefold gods. This is why you were here to take that same test that the threefold gods who went through that nigredo and got rid of their ego and became a purity of oil and salt, a purity of self. You're here to follow that same path. And when you do, just like every single one of those prophets that spoke said, if you walk the walk, do what I do, become a purity of yourself, you will have the power I have. So while you're not going to become an etheric god, or like in the Christian mythologies, they're angels, they're called. This is just an etheric being. And their entire story is predicated off of Metatron, who was just an etheric being. And then the same book says etheric beings are liars. But this guy says that he's the voice of God. So apparently he can't lie because he says so. And then they're going around saying that they're getting it from the all. And the thing is you understand as an alchemist, the all is not even a masculine or a feminine. It's everything. It's all of it put together. That's why it's the all. And then we live in the all Father, because that's the material side. We can't live in immaterial. The immaterial side is what pulled the material side together, the two pieces of the material side together. So we have a masculine material and a feminine material, but we don't have the all mother, which is part of why she gets so left out of things, because it's hard to understand something that you're not part of. You know, she's the void that created us, that made us happen. The feminine is always the void, whether you're looking at it electrically, where it's voltage, or you're looking at it as oil where it's opening up the pathways. And then the masculine is the punch coming in behind. You always have to look at the mechanics of things. And this is also why the moon is considered feminine, because the moon creates voltage. You can get a solar panel set up and go outside and notice that on a nice full moon, my solar chargers scream because it's getting enough voltage to actually charge. But then you look down at it and look at the amperage side, and there's 0 amps. And that thing's not doing nothing. So it's telling you the path is open, but ain't no water coming in.
There's no punch.
Right.
Very interesting. And of course, people have measured the temperature of moonlight, and it seems to be actually a cooling light as opposed to a heating light. Have you ever encountered that?
I couldn't tell you whether it's, do you become more cooler when you're out in the moonlight as opposed to in the shade? I haven't tested that myself. It's an interesting theory. And maybe it's not a theory, maybe it's just not. And I just haven't personally seen the evidence, because there's that's where I sit with life and that's the left-hand path. That's what the true left-hand path is, as opposed to following these, what other people say. You're like, yeah, but show me. Yeah, I need to see this. And honestly, that is where true faith comes from, in my opinion, is just like if I drop something, it's going to fall to the ground. Now, it's not gravity or however that nonsense that they're explaining, but density. Yeah, exactly. It's either way, no matter what you want to call it, it gets pushed down to the ground. And that happens every time. And so I have faith if I let go of a rock, it's going to end up on the ground, below me. And that is so once you understand the mechanics of the universe, that's where you start getting your faith. Well, I understand, because this is how it works. So I know that when I draw this to the next above and try and figure out the things above me, that's just how it works. Yeah.
But I've found that there are some things that once you read them or experience them, you just know them. You know that it's true because it just rings through every fiber of your being.
Right. So this is where you get the difference between between knowledge and wisdom. So, and this is why I'm so very, very heavily push actually doing the alchemy. So if you read every auto mechanics, or you're a musician, sir.
Yeah.
If I read every book on guitar theory and how to play the guitar and everything else, and then I went out and got on stage and tried to jump on stage with you, and I'd never actually touched a guitar, how happy would you be that I was on stage with you?
I'd be wondering why you were there.
Right.
Along with everybody else.
and then along with that, just like I could read about how chocolate pudding tastes, I will never understand it until I taste it. So that is wisdom. Yep. So until you actually start doing things with your body and setting them into your salts. So let's take this back to the cymatics. Oil or the knowledge, that's creating the vibration in your etheric side, your brain side. So that vibration's happening, but now you need it to pass into that salt, which is unfortunately being shut down by aluminum for a lot of people. You need it to pass into that salt so it can write in the salt. Okay. Because that's what not only, just like Masaru Emoto's water unlocked that vibration of the salt and showed you what the vibration is, you have to understand that if you can pull it out, you can obviously put it in. So if you hit that salt mixture, water mixture with a vibration, you're going to start writing into it.
So salt's a crystal, so that you're actually programming the salt crystals.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. And then the salt crystal will show you what it says. We just don't know how to read the vibrations yet, because you can guarantee that those specific patterns, just like Emoto showed when he said, I love you, that same pattern showed on so many of the crystals. Well, obviously that pattern means I love you. And you can start breaking down the further component pieces of that even and figuring it out and start reading the languages of vibration. And that is written into the salts, which also brings you into the things like when you start looking at the time periods in between these civilization moves, like our current civilization, it's underneath the Abrahamic, where originally, because we all live in the majority of the world's covered by Abrahamic religion of some flavor. Mm-hmm. So the Abrahamic religion started in the Middle East in a very tiny little area. And if you read their book, for 400 years they were a slave to Egypt, and for 400 years they were a slave to the Hittites, and this, that, and this and that, in all these different areas. And at the end, every time at the end of their story, the people of the area worshipped their gods and they owned their stuff. And they're like, it's just because our God's good. Well, let's flip this around and say they went into those areas, conquered them. And it takes 400 years to rewrite the generational salts. And so that way the old memories quit coming up and your civilization gets subverted. And every 400 years, you start subverting a new civilization. And they marched their way up through Italy and joined up with Rome, kept marching along the outside of Asia, got their asses handed to them by the Germanics, said not, swerved around them and went back over into English, and then came back for the Germanics, and basically then took over the entire European area. And that took about 400 years, and that was about 1000 AD. And this one's fairly easy for people. And about 400 years ago, or about 250 years ago or whatever, we started getting it in America, where they started conquering the tribal people here and rewriting everything for them. And I don't think it's going to take as long anymore, because back in the day, we used to burn our ancestors or put and release their salts. And so when we go back to the infinity of life and your oil is released and it comes back and your salts get released, well, if them salts are locked up, that side's staying in a coffin in a cement box for thousands of years. So how are you supposed to access them salt memories inside that? And so they're overwriting all these, making it even harder. So I think they're shortening this time period even.
Shortening the cycle.
Yes.
Now, here that brings to mind, we know our history is suspect in so many different ways. We don't really know our history precisely. We don't know the timelines. And there's lately I've been looking into this whole Tartarian civilization. Have you looked into that at all?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. That's certainly an interesting one. And given that people don't understand the Earth model even, because there's all kinds of arguments about it. But the fact is, just like in Alembic, the plane that we live on is more or less flat. When you look at the flask when it's bubbling, there's waves and there's high spots and low spots and all this. But more or less, the manifest plane where we're dealing with, that's basically flat. Yep. Everything under it's too dense for us, and things as they go too far up become too thin for us, and we can't deal with this. And then, of course, the firmament stopping the much thicker waters of space from crushing us then. So that's nice.
Yeah, that's a benefit there.
Yeah.
Although
really
it seems like somebody opened up that floodgate a couple times, though. I don't know.
But yeah, that Tartaria is interesting, and the idea that there could easily be continents, even still, maybe shrunken down, that we don't know about, or there could have been a civilization that they just completely wiped out. At this point, like I said, they figured out how to shut down our cell salts so we lose our memories. They locked up our generational cell salts, and so that way things aren't coming back as well. And so how easy is it at some point to subvert the entire society? 400 years apparently is what it used to take. And at the end of those 400 years, those little kids are telling you how great the society that conquered theirs is.
Yeah, because they don't have the memory. And for
Right.
people who don't know what I'm talking about with Tartaria, up until about the mid-19th century, there was Grand Tartaria, or the civilization or country, nation of Tartaria. It was in all of Asia, went all the way from China through Europe. And a lot of people are saying that the so-called ancient cathedrals were actually Tartarian buildings that they later made into cathedrals that were never cathedrals at all, because these buildings, these structures, which a lot of people refer to as Roman Greco-style buildings, they're
Right.
literally everywhere. They're on every continent. They're all over the place. There's many in the United States. So it brings to mind that this was a worldwide civilization that they've tried to wipe out of our memories. So if you want to go down that rabbit hole, it's fascinating. There's lots of good information on YouTube about it. But unfortunately, we're running down low on time here. We're getting down to our last minute, Benjamin. We're going to have you back at some point, because there's so much fun and exciting things we need to talk about, and remedies and all that good stuff.
Oh, yeah, and there's so many different places we can take this, because once you put the mechanics of alchemy into things, you can start drawing all these parallels. And it was an absolute honor to be with you, Jimmy. I couldn't thank you more, brother.
Thank you so much. And you can find Benjamin Balderson on YouTube, and keep up with the mayor. Anything else? Any other places to find you?
The Eyes Open Network. You can come on Facebook. I'm Benjamin Balderson. I'm happy to answer questions, or Odin's Alchemy on Gmail. And then I'm part of the Eyes Open Network. You can find us. We have a group you can just chat on in Facebook and ask us questions.
Okay. Thank you so much, Benjamin. Really appreciate it. Everybody, this has been Inside the Matrix. See you next week.
This is Inside the Matrix, hosted by Jimmy Brent.
Who are we talking about?
Jimmy Brent. Jimmy Brent. Jimmy Brent. Live every Sunday, 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern. Exclusively on the KCOR Digital Radio Network.
It is worldwide.
Broadcasting from an undisclosed location deep within the neon capital of the world, Las Vegas, Nevada. For more information on the host and the show, please visit InsideTheMatrix.org. That's InsideTheMatrix.org. It's time to break the chains of manipulated consciousness and claim our true nature as creative divine beings. Inside the Matrix. Inside the Matrix.
This is KCOR Las Vegas, home of the Digital Radio Network, broadcasting from a shack just south of Area 51.
Wait, that doesn't exist.
This is the KCOR Digital Radio Network. Now for the news.